preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Judy Rubin, president of the 92nd Street Y, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to our third evening in the third year of our series, The Human Mind. At this point, I am very pleased to announce that the 92nd Street Y has received a major grant for this series from the Ford Motor Company. This grant will support not only the lecture program, but also the development of a parallel education program for New York City high school students. The Ford Company shares our commitment to the education and the enrichment of our young people, and their generous support is warmly appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. We're very proud of it. Our series was developed in order to provide a context in which to probe theoretical and practical models of the brain and its functioning, to discuss how the brain relates to the mind, and in this third season, to examine the nature of human consciousness and the sources of creativity and identity. Each of the two remaining speakers who are participating in this series will lecture on a particular focused topic, helping to clarify some of these complex issues for us. Dr. Bruno Bettelheim was to have been our fourth and final speaker. Yes. I very deeply regret to announce that due to illness, Dr. Bettelheim will be unable to lecture on April 6th. And at the same time, I'm pleased to tell you that behavior and science writer Dr. Daniel Goleman, whom many of you have read in the New York Times as well as many other publications, has graciously accepted an invitation to speak on April 6th as scheduled. That's a Wednesday as tonight. This evening, the format will be as follows. Dr. Jaynes will present his talk entitled Consciousness and the Voices of the Mind, following which, in a slight departure from the way we have handled our question and answer period on previous evenings in the series, Dr. Jaynes will respond to your questions directly, coming down into the audience to take questions from those of you who are in the back rows. And naturally, he will endeavor to answer as many of your questions as time allows. Our guest this evening is Dr. Julian Jaynes, psychologist and author. He was born in West Newton, Massachusetts, studied at Harvard and McGill, and received his PhD from Yale. He is currently professor of psychology at Princeton University, as well as research psychologist. Dr. Jaynes' area of research include the evolution of the mind, the nature of consciousness, imagination, healing, and the brain, and dreams. He is the author of The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of Bicameral Mind, which has been translated into Spanish, Italian, French, and Japanese. He is also the author of Historical Conceptions of Psychology and The Consequences of Consciousness. His articles have appeared in Psychology Today, American Scientist, Art World, Contemporary Psychology, and Psychology Review, among other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, the 92nd Street Y is honored to welcome to its platform Dr. Julian Jaynes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin. Few problems have had a more interesting trajectory through the whole history of human thought as that of the problem of mind and its place in nature. Now, this is not a problem we think of every day, but I assure you it was pondered very, very seriously by most of the great thinkers of at least the past 2 centuries. And there have been various kinds of solutions to it, but I would like to first make sure that I get across to you the problem, because that's the first big point I want to get across. It used to be called the mind-body problem, with its ponderous solutions of interactionism and epiphenomenalism and parallelism and so on. But since 1859, in the theory of evolution, it became the problem of the origin of consciousness. Now, I want to point out what this problem was to Darwin and Wallace, who were the two people who brought to pass the theory of natural selection, which made the theory of evolution very, very reasonable. It is that in evolution, our anatomy, all different species, the way we're shaped and what we do and all of that can be beautifully explained on the basis of natural selection. But how about all this that happens in our heads, as we call it, in our consciousness, all our dreams and hopes and imaginations and regrets and all that? How could that have been evolved through natural selection in animal behavior? And that was the real problem for both Darwin and Wallace in 1859. Darwin, I don't think, was a very good psychologist. He, in the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, sloughed it off and said, well, they're probably back in protoplasm, there's probably mind and body, and they both evolved together. And he set out on a program of research of trying to show how there was an evolution of mind that paralleled the evolution of the body. And that really didn't work very well. Alfred Russel Wallace, whom I have a soft spot for because he is not as well known, and he thought and thought about the problem and came to the conclusion, absolutely not. All of this that goes on in our head could not have evolved through natural selection. It had to be imposed on the evolutionary string of things by God. And because of that, he then became religious and ruined his scientific reputation by attending, not because he was religious, but because he attended all these very ridiculous spiritualist sessions, seeking some kind of evidence for the imposition of God into human history and human affairs, which didn't work. There have been other solutions all along the way. One solution was, it became something called neorealism, and it is having a fashion again among physicists, namely that there's really no distinction between matter and our mental perceptions. They all can be shown to be on a continuity. And I'm sorry that that's coming up again. People like Alfred North Whitehead were indeed very involved in this. But I don't think that that really makes terribly sense. Another physicist, Eugene Wigner, that a lot of you know about, he is also sort of in that school. But there were other ideas of this that were much more important. And one was that consciousness comes in when we have learning. I'm going to be dealing with that in a moment to show you that learning really has nothing to do with it. It really comes from British empiricism and John Locke, which said that indeed if you have, we have two things happening in the world at once that are contiguous, then we get the association of ideas in consciousness. And therefore, if you could find the association of ideas or learning in primitive animals, that showed they had to have a mind in which there were ideas that could be associated, therefore they had consciousness. After so much psychology, we know that that whole kind of approach is, I think, wrong, without going into it in too much detail. There are other solutions along the way, such as one rather depressing solution of Helpless Spectator of T.H. Huxley, that consciousness is nothing more than the smoke going behind the train. And the smoke doesn't determine where the train goes. The tracks have already decided that a long time ago. Well, if that's so, it's odd that consciousness seems to have so much to do with what we are going to do in planning out. It doesn't work. And there were other kinds of solutions. One called emergent evolution, which is having another fashion with Roger Sperry, I'm afraid now, which is very mystical. It doesn't say very much. It just says when you get the juxtaposition of, let's say, parts of the brain or something like that, then consciousness emerges. Well, I don't think that explains it either. I think that indeed we have to look somewhat more deeply and exactly about consciousness, and we've got to first find out just what is consciousness in order to proceed toward any kind of a solution to this question. Well, if I were to ask you, what is consciousness? I think most of you would sort of think, well, awareness, perception, or something of that sort, and not be satisfied with that at all, and nor would I be. I think we first have to start off and try to say what something is not. When we have something as difficult as consciousness to try to define, we should first try to cut it off from what it isn't. Now, the first thing that consciousness is not, it's not all that's going on in your minds right now, whatever that could mean. It is not all perception. If you think it's perception, you can go back to and think of protozoa and think of your white cells that are going around in your blood right now, and they perceive bacteria. And that would mean, if that is consciousness, that then you have something like 10,000 conscious beings swirling around in your bloodstream right now, and everybody here in this audience. And I think that's a little far-fetched. I think we can dismiss that. And there are lots of other things that consciousness is not. It's just not as extensive as we think it is. Right now, our eyes are going at 18 times a second, and yet you see me as a steady person, I hope. And right now, I see in the back of the room, I see people that are probably this big a visual angle versus somebody in the front row, which is this big. Well, I don't think those are pygmies back there and giants up here. All of that kind of correction is done for me by my nervous system. Consciousness has nothing to do with it whatever, and can't even change it. These are the perceptual constancies, which shows just how much the nervous system does for us. Now, if I were to say something like, I want to show you the problems now, if I say, am I conscious of what I'm saying now? It's a little difficult, because if I become conscious of each word that I say, I couldn't speak at all. I am not taking my lexicon and selecting something from it and sticking it on this syntactical structure and then coming out with this speech. Instead, it's like having an intention that's never been fully described, and out comes this speech, for good or for ill. And it's the same thing with you listening. What does it mean for you to say, to be conscious of me speaking? I hope you are conscious of that intention and the meaning I am trying to get across, and perhaps a little less on the way I may be saying it. And so we can go on to other things of when we are not conscious, when we're typing or something of that kind. And I like to use the metaphor of a flashlight. If you ask a flashlight in a completely dark room to turn itself on and look around the room to see if there was any light in the room, wherever the flashlight looked, it would find that it was perfectly bright. And so it would come to the wrong answer that indeed this is a completely lit, brilliant room, when in fact it was not. It was almost the opposite. Now that's something like what we do with consciousness. When we think consciousness is in all our behavior, and it just isn't. There is so much that we do without consciousness at all. Another thing that consciousness is not is that it's not a copy of experience. And this goes back to Locke, and I won't go into that again, but it's like, I think Locke used the blank white paper, and the shades of Locke, I'm afraid, are perhaps getting a little angry at what I'm saying. But I think, Mr. Locke, that you would have used a camera, perhaps, to take pictures instead of a tabula rasa, because that's sort of what we would use nowadays. And you can show in so many ways that consciousness doesn't do that at all. If I ask you what numbers go with what letters on a telephone, here's something you have seen how many times in your lives. And if somebody here has not been aware of this before, I'm sure you don't have the answer. It's just very certain. So you see, consciousness isn't picking up on everything that's happening. And supposing, here's another way to look at it. Supposing I ask you to think of the last time you were swimming. Okay, think of the last time you were swimming. Now, 80% of you, I can show it without even having a show of hands, because I've done this quite a few times, had a bird's eye view of yourself swimming, or else a pool's eye view of yourself swimming, something you have never seen in your life. And only if you're on a swimming team or it's your sport or something like that, did you have all the feeling of the temperature differentials, the breathing that was going on, the muscular kinds of things. It's an astonishing phenomenon. It's what we call an autoscopic image. And it shows that consciousness is not copying things. It is making up things of what things must have been and fitting them together in somewhat of a new pattern. So consciousness is not a copy of experience. And the third thing, I'm only going to 5 here, this is rather an academic beginning to my talk, is that consciousness is not necessary for learning. We study 3 kinds of learning in psychology. We have plain old Pavlovian conditioning, and you can show, we had a good psychologist named Razran here at Columbia who showed that, not the late Dr. Razran, who showed that consciousness can erase conditioning, let alone be necessary for it. And you can get conditioning in the hind leg of a cockroach. And anybody who wants to say that that is consciousness, I think is heading in the wrong direction. Another thing that we study is motor learning. Not so much now as we used to back in the 1920s when telegraphy was very important and typing, all these learning of the skills started to be studied very much by psychologists. And just to summarize a lot, it came out that people were astonished that indeed consciousness seemed to have little to do with it. Once someone got onto the problem, then it became sort of organic. Some of you have heard of some of the Zen practices, like Zen and the art of archery, or some of the things that even coaches might tell you, like the game of inner tennis. I've forgotten who the author is. All of these things are showing the same thing, that in the skills that we can learn, it is not consciousness that is fitting them together. It is something else, and consciousness, of course, can get us into this, can make us practice it, but that is not what is behind the learning of the skill. A third thing that we study in psychology, and study much more of, is, sorry if it makes such a noise when I blow my nose here. I have this microphone here that can be rather embarrassing at times. Is instrumental learning. Now, I'll just give you one example of that. That means learning solutions to a problem, or what Skinner calls operant conditioning. And in the Midwest, there was a psychology professor who gave a whole lecture on this learning without awareness, it was called. And he'd like to pace back and forth the way I am doing and like to do. And the class didn't quite believe this. So the next time, they thought they would really test this out. And so everybody, when he was on this side of his platform or stage, everybody would whisper and they wouldn't pay attention to him, wouldn't laugh at his jokes, and so on and so forth. And whenever he crossed the midline and was on this side, they'd pay rapt attention to him and applaud him and so on. Well, he kept going back and forth, till finally, by the end of the lecture, he was practically over here and out the door without thinking that anything had happened to him, and he was extremely cross when he found out. But he should have been extremely happy that the students had learned their lessons so well. So consciousness is not necessary for learning. But how about now the fourth thing, thinking and reasoning? That sounds crazy. We sort of automatically think that consciousness is necessary. Of course, that's what consciousness is. But wait, it's not that simple. Back in 1901, there was a graduate student in Würzburg called Karl Marbe. And he did a fascinating experiment that I think was historically important, historically equal in psychology to the Michelson-Morley experiment in physics. But what a contrast. The Michelson-Morley experiment, I think as most of you know, was extremely complicated and sophisticated to do, even though the result was very simple, that there is no such thing as ether. But the Marba experiment was so simple that people laugh at it now. They can't think of that as an experiment. All it was indeed a table with subjects who would come in, and they had two weights that looked equal, but one was heavier than the other. They were simply to judge which is heavier and then introspect on how they got the answer. The point of the question is that Marba was a graduate student. This is how they did things in those days. And all the subjects were senior professors. And all of them had to have been through 1,000 experiments in introspection before this experiment. And it was astonishing to them all that there was nothing in consciousness for that kind of judgment. Now it's hard to get that kind of feeling. You can try this yourself by taking two things that you know are unequal. But see if there's anything in consciousness for that particular judgment, which is certainly part of thought. And there isn't. And it started a whole school called the School of Imageless Thought, the Würzburg School, which I think is extremely important. And they went on and studied this in many ramifications because nobody could quite believe it. It was very upsetting to a number of people. I'm going to use the blackboard here to give you another one, and I know perfectly well that people in the balcony and people in the back cannot see. So if you'll excuse us here in the first few rows and myself being an elite, we will now use the blackboard a little bit. I'll try to describe what I'm doing. So supposing I put this problem down on the board, and I ask you, what is the next geometric figure in this series? I have a circle, and a triangle, a circle, and a triangle, and a circle. And how do you get the answer? Introspect right here. This is like the Würzburg experiment. I suggest that you didn't do anything in consciousness to find that out. It just came like that. Just jumped out at you. And that's very, very like the Würzburg kind of experiment. Now, you may say, that's all right, that's such a simple kind of thing, but how about something more complicated? Well, I have a friend of mine, a late friend of mine, Paul Oppenheim in Princeton, who was one of Einstein's great, great friends. And Einstein would describe to him sometimes how in the morning he shaved in front of a mirror with one of these big old-fashioned razors. He never got out of that habit, big, horrible thing. And he had to be very careful, lest in the morning he cut himself, and suddenly he would get the solution to some equation he was trying to solve. This phenomenon I'm sure most of you have heard of. Henri Poincaré was another one who wrote extensively about this. In World War II, Wolfgang Köhler was told by physicists in England, we don't have the laboratory anymore. We have the 3 Bs, the bath, the bus, and the bed. That's where all ideas come from. They jump out at us when we are not expecting them. So that's what I mean by saying that consciousness is not really necessary for all kinds of thinking or reasoning. Of course it's necessary for complicated kinds of things where we have to get into them with our consciousness. And finally, something I almost wanted to skip, something about the location of consciousness. The reason I wanted to skip it is because a lot of people can make ideas that take deductions from this which are not true. If I ask you where your consciousness is, all of you probably will say, up in my head. And I'd like to suggest that there's no reason for that. There's nothing inside. We think of consciousness as space, a little space behind our eyes. And particularly if I look at somebody and make eye-to-eye contact with them up close here, I tend to think behind their eyes is a little space, and that you, as you're making eye contact with me, think behind my eyes is a little space, and magically the words are coming out, and so on. And ladies and gentlemen, inside our heads, there is nothing but physiological tissue. It happens to be neurological tissue that we call a brain, but there are no spaces in it like that at all. And that's something to think about. I'm saying it's a functional space. It's something we have created that we use and is important, but it's not really there. And some of the more sophisticated behaviorists have made a huge, big point of this to try to explain that consciousness doesn't exist. But of course, I don't agree with that at all. That consciousness is fashioned by us in a functional kind of way. I always like to compare it to mathematics. If you remember back in learning geometry when you had to make projections with dotted lines in order to prove triangles congruent or something like that. Those were extremely important things to do, those projections. And this is something like the way I look at consciousness. Well, this is then what I wanted to say about a critique of how we look at consciousness. Now, remember what I have said, that it's not nearly as extensive as we used to think it was. It is not a copy of experience. It is not perception. It has no particular place. It is not necessary for learning, and it has no location, and it is not necessary for speaking or listening or understanding. I shouldn't have an allergy at this time of year if I'm going to use one of these, so excuse me again. But I'd like to pause here just to make you think of the idea that there could have been people, a race of people, who could think and could reason and could speak and could understand and could solve problems, but who were not conscious. That's the point of this first part of my talk, and I now turn to the second part. And what I'd like to do, begin the second part, is indeed to read you a little bit to get us over the hump of what consciousness is. Subjective conscious mind is an analog of what we call the real world. It is built up with the vocabulary or lexical field whose terms are all metaphors or analogs of behavior in the physical world. Its reality is of the same order as mathematics. It allows us to shortcut behavioral processes and arrive at more adequate decisions. Like mathematics, it is an operator rather than a thing or a repository, and it is intimately bound up with volition and decision. Consider the language we use to describe conscious processes. The most prominent group of words used to describe mental events are visual. We see solutions to problems, such as if you solve this problem, you would say, I see it is a triangle. Well, you don't really see it at all. That's simply an analog or metaphor of actual seeing. And so we have all these other words from seeing something from a viewpoint or grappling with its difficulties, and every word we use to refer to mental events is a metaphor of something in the behavioral world. And the adjectives that we use to describe physical behavior in real space are analogically taken over to describe mental behavior in mind space. We speak of the conscious mind as being quick or slow, of somebody being nimble-witted, strong-minded, weak-minded, broad, deep and open, or narrow-minded, and so on. Now that's just the beginnings of the kind of theory, and you can say, how indeed can you say this is metaphor and analogy, since these are just sort of figures of speech, as we called them back in grammar school. I'm not going to go into the whole theory of metaphor on which this is based, but metaphor is a much bigger thing than simply comparison between two things. It is the generation of new language, the generation of new kinds of meaning. If I use a common but beautiful metaphor, I think of such as saying the snow blankets the ground. Well, that's terribly simple, and it's simply trying to describe how the snow lies on the ground. But there are what I call paraphiers, or associations of using that word blanket, that are rather good. Instead of it being cold, it's warm. There is a birth coming. There is going to be a renewal coming spring. All of that is indeed in that using of that one word of blanket, with the idea of refreshing sleep and then waking up. That's just a tiny example of it, and one can go on much more seriously than that, and to show that indeed there are many principles that we can get out of that. Now, there are certain kinds of features, as I call them, of consciousness that I'd like just to describe 3 of them. One is that in consciousness, in this space right now that you feel is inside your minds as I ask you to be conscious, in that space we have a process called spatialization. And I don't mean anything more than what I've already described, that you think of it as a space. And in that space, if I ask you to think of time, it's a space. There isn't time there at all. You cannot think of time without making it into a space or almost anything else. If I asked you, for example, when you were seeing yourself swimming, who did the looking? This is what we call the analog I. Written this way. It's not E-Y-E. It's the analog I. And this is the same thing of Kant's, now the term has escaped me. Yes, transcendental self. It's the same thing. It's this contentless essence that has to be there for all consciousness. And what does the analog I do in mind space? It narratizes. And that's just a simple kind of meaning that indeed it tells something over time so that everything becomes a story, a narration. If I asked any of you right now to be conscious of yourself and tell me what you're thinking, you would say, well, I had dinner so-and-so, and then I came here, and afterwards I'm going to do this, and so on. All strung into this narrative a long time. That's all narratization means. Those are the 3 main features of consciousness, and I'm not going into some of the others, which is salience and recruitment and exerption and concentration and suppression, because they're not so important to this lecture. There are also kinds of modes of consciousness, but that takes quite a while to explain too. But of course, I think we all know the main mode of consciousness. I think it's verbal, at least with me it is. Constant dialogues going on, or monologues. And the second kind can be visual, where we are imagining what we're going to do next summer or something like that, or an activity. And there are other kinds of modes we can go into. But that's enough for now to give us an idea of consciousness in a different kind of key, to use Suzanne Langer's term there. Is that really what consciousness is? Yes, I think it is, and I think it's along those lines. An analog I narratizing in a mind space. Now to go back to the problem that we started off with. Where in evolution could that have started? Now, one of the big things to realize here is that what I've said is that consciousness is based on metaphor and analogy and language. There is no consciousness without language. Anybody who has a pet dog finds it awfully difficult to say that. Or anybody who's been studying the chimpanzees, can't say that. We have such empathy, such identification that we want to see ourselves in animals and so on, with great sympathy and so on, which I think is a noble thing. But it isn't our kind of consciousness which is based on language. And that would mean if we wanted to solve the problem of the origin of language, well, let's go back in human history, because that's where it seems it might have happened. Now, for the elite up front, I have drawn some, this is a time chart here. What it says here, for those who can't read it, begins 200,000 BC, skips down to 10,000 BC, 3,000, 2,000 BC, and up to 2,000, which is what we're heading into. Where in all this could indeed consciousness have started? Well, one of the interesting things that happened right here in 3000 BC is the thing that we call writing. That is, taking the phonemes that compose our speech and putting it down in hieroglyphs or cuneiform on wet clay. And that is an extremely important event. I don't have to go on saying that, because then we have records that human beings are keeping, and we could go back and look at those early records and see, is there an analog I narratizing in a mind space, making the decisions? Now, those of you who know ancient languages know that hieroglyphics and cuneiform are extremely difficult. They've only recently been really deciphered, that when they are concrete, they are indeed probably very clear. But when they are not, they are still difficult to translate. And I think there's a great deal of similarity between that and Rorschach cards. I know of one experiment that Edmund Gordon, when he was a graduate student at University of Pennsylvania, did. He had what was called a Sumerian proverb, so-called, probably shouldn't be called that, and he sent it around to all the cuneiform experts all over the world to see how they would translate it. Well, he got back some of a huge variety of answers. I mean, one answer would say simply, this is simply a matter about fertility in the fields, and it's interesting from the point of view of agriculture. And another person wrote back and said, this is indeed the strongest evidence I have seen for rampant homosexuality in the Sumerian world. Well, with such differences as that, when we go through something like mental words, it's pretty hard to be certain of what we're doing. So we should go back to a language which we have some kind of continuity with and criticism of. And I'd like to suggest that that is Greek when we look for a long kind of passage. Of course, we could look at Hebrew, but we would have to go somewhat later in Hebrew, because in Greek we can go back to the Iliad. The Iliad, there's lots of debate about the Iliad and what its date is, but it is the story of the Trojan War that happened in 1235 BC, and it became changed as it went on through the various kind of aerodoi and rhapsodies until it became written down perhaps around 800 BC. And Homer may have been the rhapsody who first wrote it down, or maybe he never existed at all. But I think the idea that Homer wrote the Iliad in his youth and the Odyssey in his old age is simply nonsense. It is oral poetry, and I think it's a very important thing to realize. Now, if we look at the Iliad, and perhaps I should say the older parts of the Iliad, because there are incursions that come in from modern times. We know that a lot of incursions around the time of Pindar in 500 BC, and some from later times. But if we look at the older parts of the Iliad and ask, are people deciding things with an analog I, narratizing in a mind space? And if you ask that question of what Achilles is deciding, or Hector, or Agamemnon, I think you come to the conclusion that no, they are not deciding things with consciousness. And then how is anything decided? What happens? Someone goes along, and then there's a problem to be solved. Whether to continue the Trojan War or not, or whatever. And in comes a voice called a god, telling the person what to do. Now that voice, called a god, I think is an auditory, verbal hallucination, similar to those that Joan of Arc had, similar to those that Emanuel Swedenborg, remarkable man, if you know of him, or William Blake had, similar to some extent, those which modern schizophrenics had, similar to what some of you have heard. Because in an audience this size, there is a certain percentage of you who have heard auditory hallucinations and probably didn't dare tell anybody about them, because you have always been brought up in the idea that that means you're crazy. It doesn't. That's just one of the DSM-3 signs of it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that. Lots of normal people have auditory hallucinations. But it is in a very disturbed person who can't get his life together and can't work out things, yes, that it is diagnostic of schizophrenia. But I'm suggesting that this goes way back in history, and here we have it in the Iliad, all through the Iliad. And what's more, all of the other literature at this time, that people, when there was that stress of solving a problem, stress cued it off physiologically from somewhere in the brain, there was an auditory hallucination that told the person what to do. This is what we're calling the bicameral mind. It is just a bad metaphor on a bicameral legislature, and it's not a very good one. I don't think the Senate and the House of Representatives are very good as matching up to this, but it does mean that there was an upper house of the God side and a lower house of the human being side, and the God side decided everything, and this was volition back at that time. And it's a very simple kind of thing in which a person was told what to do. Now, of course, you can say, it's impossible. Everybody would be hearing all kinds of different things. And that is not true, because what you have are the expectancies built up. And I'm suggesting that somewhere in the brain, there is an area that is processing all admonitory information, by which I mean everything your parents have told you, your visitors have told you, your kings and everybody else, and priests, what is expected, and that is processed in some part of the brain. Yes, I'm pointing to my right hemisphere. I'm going to be saying that, as some of you know. And that is where the auditory hallucination originates from. Now, that's a hypothesis that you want to start with and then see, does this work out? Well, we want to go to other civilizations, going away from Greece, and see if there is any truth to this. Let me just mention Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had these big city-states in which the ruler was the owner of the land, and it was a wooden statue. And the wooden statue lived in a gaginu, lived in quotes, and a gaginu was a big room at the base of the old type of ziggurat. And everything was done with elaborate ceremony, all kinds of ritual for these idols, gods, they were called. They weren't statues of gods, they were gods. And we have literature that says, indeed, people approached these statues and heard these hallucinations coming from them. Lots of them doing that. This is in Mesopotamia. And everybody had his own individual god there called his Ili, I-L-I. Note how close that is to the Hebrew Eli. And it was a situation in which you have human beings in a hierarchy and gods in a hierarchy, each person with his personal god, then there are gods above that, and so on. A whole pyramid like a house of cards, that indeed if it gets jostled enough, it breaks down, as I'm going to mention in a moment. And then if we go over to Egypt, it's slightly different and not quite as interesting. It is where indeed you have a different kind of situation where the Pharaoh himself is the god and becomes Osiris on death. This is quite different from Mesopotamia. It's interesting that these two neighboring countries almost have such different kind of types of bicameral kingdoms. Of these, they weren't kingdoms, they were theocracies, because the head of them always was a god, not a human being. And in Egypt, the personal god is not the Ili, the personal god is a Ka, the K-A. And everybody has his own Ka, they all in a hierarchy again, leading up indeed to the Pharaoh himself. And it is all very intricately, and it can be worked out very intricately with the theory of the bicameral mind, so that we can understand for the first time this strange stuff about the emperor becoming with his Ka, Osiris, after he dies, and that's the person that is heard next by the next in line, and so on. Now, that's in those huge places back then, big cradle of civilization in the Near East. Civilization begins in various places in the Near East and then spreads throughout Mesopotamia into Anatolia, then into Egypt, then into, indeed, southern Russia and into India, then into Thailand, and then into China, and then indeed independently begins. I should have also said that it goes south into Africa with the Nak, which is a bicameral civilization, and then civilization begins perhaps independently, perhaps not, in the whole series of civilizations leading up to the Aztec in Mesoamerica, and then perhaps independently, but we don't really know, in the series of civilizations leading up to the Inca in the Andean highlands. And wherever we look, in all of those, we find some evidence of the bicameral mind. We find idols, or where we have any kind of literature. They're talking about gods all the time. Or where we have an interface between, let's say, something like the Spaniards and the Incas coming together. The Spaniards, the priests, would write back to Spain about how all these people heard the voice of the devil speaking to them from their idols in the temples. So this kind of evidence seems to be very important, and I was very worried when I first learned about the ubiquity of idols and how strange they are for us to understand. And then I realized that in the Iliad, where the idea had come from, there are no idols at all. So I was in Greece at the time, and I went to see Professor Sakalarakis, who's the curator at the Museum of Antiquities that I'm sure some of you have visited. And he said, yes, that is strange. Because when we excavate a temple coming directly from that period, we find it knee-deep in broken idols. So there is a place where indeed all the idolatry has been suppressed somehow and for some reason. I mean, anybody can speculate on that. But that is the bicameral civilization, and I think it started in the Near East, and I think it came out of a new kind of social organization so that human beings could move from a tribal people to a civilized people, by which I mean not anything good or bad, but living in great big societies where everybody didn't know everybody else. That's simple. And you find that indeed among tribal peoples, everybody has to know everybody else, to know their place in the hierarchy. And it's the same thing in other primates like chimpanzees, but particularly gorillas. And then we can move to these cities when we have this new kind of arrangement of the bicameral mind with all these gods and hierarchies, and perhaps later on priests to sort out these particular things, and it gets fairly complex. Now, here I have 200,000 to 10,000 BC, and this is indeed what I'm not sure. I used to call it Neanderthal, but ideas of Neanderthal are changing now. What happens? Someone goes along, and then there's a problem to be solved. Whether to continue the Trojan War or not, or whatever. And in comes a voice called a god, telling the person what to do. Now that voice, called a god, I think is an auditory, verbal hallucination, similar to those that Joan of Arc had, similar to those that Emanuel Swedenborg, a remarkable man, if you know of him, or William Blake had, similar to some extent, those which modern schizophrenics had, similar to what some of you have heard. Because in an audience this size, there is a certain percentage of you who have heard auditory hallucinations and probably didn't dare tell anybody about them because you have always been brought up in the idea that that means you're crazy. It doesn't. That's just one of the DSM-3 signs of it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that. Lots of normal people have auditory hallucinations. But it is, a very disturbed person who can't get his life together and can't work out things, yes, that it is diagnostic of schizophrenia. But I'm suggesting that this goes way back in history, and here we have it in the Iliad, all through the Iliad. And what's more, all of the other literature at this time, that people, when there was that stress of solving a problem, stress cued it off physiologically from somewhere in the brain, there was an auditory hallucination that told the person what to do. This is what we're calling the bicameral mind. It is just a bad metaphor on a bicameral legislature. And it's not a very good one. I don't think the Senate and the House of Representatives are very good as matching up to this. But it does mean that there was an upper house of human beings. God's side decided everything. And this was volition back at that time. And it's a very simple kind of thing in which a person was told what to do. Now, of course, you can say, it's impossible. Everybody would be hearing all kinds of different things. And that is not true, because what you have are the expectancies built up. And I'm suggesting that somewhere in the brain, there is an area that is processing all admonitory information, by which I mean everything your parents have told you, your visitors have told you, your kings and everybody else, and priests, what is expected, and that is processed in some part of the brain. Yes, I'm pointing to my right hemisphere. I'm going to be saying that, as some of you know. And that is where the auditory hallucination originates from. Now, that's a hypothesis that you want to start with and then see, does this work out? Well, we want to go to other civilizations, going away from Greece, and see if there is any truth to this. Let me just mention Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had these big city-states in which the ruler was the owner of the land, and it was a wooden statue. And the wooden statue lived in a gaginyu, lived in quotes, and a gaginyu was a big room at the base of the old type of ziggurat. And everything was done with elaborate ceremony, all kinds of ritual for these idols, gods, they were called. They weren't statues of gods, they were gods. And we have literature that says, indeed, people approached these statues and heard these hallucinations coming from them. Lots of them doing that. This is in Mesopotamia. And everybody had his own individual god there called his Ili, I-L-I. Note how close that is to the Hebrew Eli. And it was a situation in which you have human beings in a hierarchy and gods in a hierarchy, each person with his personal god, then there are gods above that, and so on. A whole pyramid like a house of cards, that indeed if it gets jostled enough, it breaks down, as I'm going to mention in a moment. And then if we go over to Egypt, it's slightly different and not quite as interesting. It is where indeed you have a different kind of situation where the Pharaoh himself is the god and becomes Osiris on death. This is quite different from Mesopotamia. It's interesting that these two neighboring countries almost have such different kind of types of bicameral kingdoms. Of these, they weren't kingdoms, they were theocracies, because the head of them always was a god, not a human being. And in Egypt, the personal god is not the Ili, the personal god is a Ka, the K-A. And everybody has his own Ka, they all in a hierarchy again, leading up indeed to the Pharaoh himself. And it is all very intricately, and it can be worked out very intricately with the theory of the bicameral mind, so that we can understand for the first time this strange stuff about the emperor becoming with his Ka, Osiris, after he dies, and that's the person that is heard next by the next in line, and so on. Now, that's in those huge places back then, big cradle of civilization in the Near East. Civilization begins in various places in the Near East and then spreads throughout Mesopotamia into Anatolia, then into Egypt, then into, indeed, southern Russia and into India, then into Thailand, and then into China, and then, indeed, independently begins. I should have also said that it goes south into Africa with the Nak, which is a bicameral civilization, and then civilization begins perhaps independently, perhaps not, in the whole series of civilizations leading up to the Aztec in Mesoamerica. and then perhaps independently, but we don't really know, in the series of civilizations leading up to the Inca in the Andean highlands. And wherever we look, in all of those, we find some evidence of the bicameral mind. We find idols, or where we have a kind of literature there talking about gods all the time, or where we have an interface between, let's say, something like the Spaniards and the Incas coming together. The Spaniards, the priests, would write back to Spain about how all these people heard the voice of the devil speaking to them from their idols in the temples. So this kind of evidence seems to be very important, and I was very worried when I first learned about the ubiquity of idols and how strange they are for us to understand. And then I realized that in the Iliad, where the idea had come from, there are no idols at all. So I was in Greece at the time, and I went to see Professor Sakalarakis, who's the curator at the Museum of Antiquities that I'm sure some of you have visited. And he said, yes, that is strange. Because when we excavate a temple coming directly from that period, we find it knee-deep in broken idols. So there is a place where indeed all the idolatry has been suppressed somehow and for some reason. I mean, anybody can speculate on that. But that is the bicameral civilization, and I think it started in the Near East, and I think it came out of a new kind of social organization so that human beings could move from a tribal people to a civilized people, by which I mean not anything good or bad, but living in great big societies where everybody didn't know everybody else. That's simple. And you find that indeed among tribal peoples, everybody has to know everybody else, to know their place in the hierarchy. And it's the same thing in other primates like chimpanzees, but particularly gorillas. And then we can move to these cities when we have this new kind of arrangement of the bicameral mind with all these gods and hierarchies, and perhaps later on priests to sort out these particular things, and it gets fairly complex. Here I have 200,000 to 10,000 BC, and this is indeed what I'm not sure. I used to call it Neanderthal, but ideas of Neanderthal are changing now. But it's when human beings were going around in a tribal situation, or bands as we should call them, and language was evolving. And language finished evolving somewhere around 10,000 BC, and I think hearing hallucinations was just an adjunct of that, and developed right along this time. And then we go to big civilizations that just jump into the historical record here, 9,000 BC. And then we have these huge bicameral kingdoms in which there is evidence for hearing voices, hearing auditory hallucinations through them all. And then things get too complicated, somewhere around 1400 BC. Now, this is the breakdown of the bicameral mind. It's most clearly seen in Assyria. Around 1400 BC, there is this vicious tyrant called Tukulti-Ninurta I. In the East Berlin Museum, you can find an altar about this size from here down, and on the front of it is carved a picture of Tukulti-Ninurta pointing and then kneeling in front of what is an empty throne. And that kind of scene has never been shown before. At least I've searched for one and can't find it. And so this, I think, is heralding the breakdown of the bicameral mind. You find this in the literature. You find it in the great piece of literature called Ludlu Belnequi. The first 3 lines of the damaged first tablet read something like, "Where is the god that used to tell me what to do? Where is the goddess that used to lead me by the hand? What have I done that the gods and goddesses no longer speak to me?" Which is simply a description of this. And I'd like to bring up to you the echo there is in the great Hebrew Psalms. Like Psalm 42, as the heart pants after the water brooks, so pants my mind, it should be, after you, O Elohim, plural. That beautiful, beautiful psalm seems to have back here a beginning in this other kind of cuneiform literature as well. This is the breakdown in Assyria, and we find other things, examples here. We find the introduction of the idea of heaven, which hasn't been there before, because that's where the gods have gone, with Anu in the sky, as Gilgamesh epic says. And we find the institution of real prayer, as I've just mentioned with Dekolti. We find the beginning of demons and evil gods, because gods that won't speak to you, just like people who refuse to speak to you, they must mean harm for you. So in 1000 BC, the people in Babylon were going around the city draped in amulets and all these charms saying, "Protect me from Pazazu, the wind demon," and all that kind of thing. And at the same time, we had the development of a new kind of making decisions. And this is divination. And there's been occasional divination before this time, but only occasional. And now it really rises to the surface. There are all kinds of simple things like oil on water, which is one way in the Hebrew Testament that we find Jacob divining. But there are other simple things like throwing lots, which we also find in the Bible. We have throwing of dice and many, many other kinds of simple divination like this. But the two most important and serious ones are first expistacy, which is this rather ugly thing where you priest says prayers into a lamb or a goat, which is then sacrificed, and he's cut open, and particularly his liver becomes very important, because that shows, remember, they're trying to get at the messages of the gods. What is it that the gods intend for us? Because they are silent, they must speak to us through these signs, and this would reveal what the gods intended for us. And then the final method of divination, which is with us still, and this is astrology. And it's interesting that we still have this, particularly in our newspapers. And it's interesting, too, that even a skeptic such as myself, when he comes to Pisces, will tend to look at it and why? Why? Because I'm so unsure of what my life is going to be. Let me tell you that the unsureness of life back at this time, when you had the certainty of God's telling you what to do and who you were, and suddenly that was taken away. And it's in that agony that consciousness develops on the basis of metaphor. We can't see this clearly in the cuneiform literature, at least I can't. But when we go over to Greece, there we can find this wonderfully written record. Begin with the two Homeric poems, begin with the Iliad and going to the Odyssey, and then through Hesiod, to the lyric and elegiac poets of the next 2 centuries, and then up into including people like Sappho, talking about the internality of love, and Alcaeus, and a number of very, very interesting poets that most people haven't heard of, and then ending up with, in 600 BC, with Solon. And Solon is the first person to talk about mind the way you and I do. And it sort of jumps into place there. He uses the word nous, N-O-U-S, as much as almost any other word, far more than anybody else. And he's the person that says, know thyself, although that's given to the Delphic oracle by some people. But how can you know yourself unless you have an analog eye narratizing in a mind space and can go back over spatialized time to try to figure out who you are and what you are trying to do and going to do. That is indeed the story of the coming of consciousness that in Greece, and I could spend a lot more time on this. It's only briefly covering this. I find that when I said that the bicameral mind broke down, I should have said a little bit more about some of the causes of this breakdown, that indeed one of them was the advent of writing itself, that took away the auditory power of the bicameral mind. Once things could be written, as in Hammurabi's hegemony, as he tried to run it with what we would regard as memos, although they were clay tablets, we have a lot of them. It stretches things out, and it doesn't have the power that the auditory hallucinations did. With auditory hallucinations, you cannot get away from them. They are just there. Now, the third place we can look and see the coming of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind is indeed something that's much closer to us all. And this is indeed what we can get at by calling it among the refugees of some of the terrible things that happened at this time. Just about 1400 BC, there was this huge eruption of the island of Thera that you can still see. I saw it just a couple of years ago, this huge, it's 20 miles wide anyway, crater. And this caused a tsunami and a whole bunch of the land to fall down below the surface of the sea. It's the origin of the tale of Atlantis, as is told in Plato. And this caused a game of musical chairs, of one kingdom moving in on another. We have invasions all over the place. In Greece, it's the Dorian invasions. In Egypt, it's the invasions of the people from the sea. And then there are descriptions in cuneiform tablets of people screaming down through the Lebanon, and all this dispute over lands. And then we come to what is the various derivations of this word. I was following a person who would say it really meant refugee. And it's in the language of Akkad, and the word is Habiru, which then becomes our word Hebrew. And the story of the Hebrews, or one branch of the Hebrews, is what is told in our Hebrew Testament. Now, any of you who know what was called the higher biblical criticism in Germany at the last part of the last century will know that it's pretty hard to look for historical proof of any kind because it seems to be woven together from many different sources. Like the first 2 chapters of Genesis tell different creation stories, although I know that there are ways of saying that it is not quite like that. I've talked to rabbis about this, and there is plenty of room for disagreement. And there are other things that show such disagreement within the Hebrew Testament that how can we look at that for evidence? Well, there are the pure books that are usually by one author, and that we know that very well. That is short books, and I wish you would look at them. And I'm trying to be very cold and scientific here, but I certainly don't want to be sacrilegious to anybody's beliefs. If we take the oldest, which is the book of Amos, and the date is clearly 800 BC, and compare it with the most recent, which is the book of Koheleth, or Ecclesiastes, which is 200 BC, we should try to get some kind of comparison, perhaps, between something closer to the bicameral mind and something closer to consciousness. Well, let me just tell you that indeed, if you look at Amos, he is not a wise old man, I don't think. I suggest he was a shepherd boy, 16 or 17 years old, who has been full of the Hebrew history all his life, out in the fields, watching the stars and so on. And when he says in some of the translations, "Thus saith the Lord," and out comes this marvelous kind of speech with such authenticity that indeed he has scribes gathered around him and copy this down. This doesn't come from him, it indeed comes from Yahweh. And that is very, very close to the bicameral mind, except it is much more powerful, much more vivid, and much more historical, much more about a whole people, not about an individual. When we go to Koheleth or Ecclesiastes, there we have something very, very different, in which, if you remember the great hymn to time, that is the 2nd chapter of Ecclesiastes, there is a time for love and a time for war, a time for planting, a time for harvest. It's been too overused, but it's a beautiful kind of conscious spatializing out of time. And in the very first chapter, he says, in my heart, I see, this use of the word see, I see that wisdom excelleth folly, full of profound metaphors and profound meanings of this kind. I think you can see that indeed there is this comparison, and it works out a little bit here between the comparison of indeed Koheleth and Amos. Now you can make other kinds of analyses. You can go through in the story itself, when indeed Moses is told, otherwise Deuteronomy says that Moses is the last person to see God face to face and talk to him as man to man, and how then God is only heard by the prophets, or perhaps seen by Ezekiel, and then the age of prophecy dies away. We have the books of wisdom. The whole long, majestic story is the story of the fading away of God's voice and the coming of wisdom. Now, I'm trying to say you can have other constructions on that. That is just in the text. And it's a very moving kind of story, which of course was the great contribution to world history. Now that's all the story I'm going to tell about the coming of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind here. We are doing other studies. We're doing studies in China now, which by Michael Carr, one of my colleagues, which shows indeed that if you take the Xi Qing and analyze it properly, you can divide it into 4 parts, and you can show the increase of consciousness words in that. Astonishingly, it's at the same particular period of history as the Hebrew Bible and as the Greek literature. And of course, we want to do it for India, but it's very, very difficult to do that because the data don't go back that far. Now, I heard in Dr. Rubin's introduction that indeed this was to touch on something about the brain and its relationship to consciousness. On that subject, I can't say a thing at all. But I can say something about what I regard as relationship of the brain to the bicameral mind. Here is the left hemisphere, and I think most of you know that here in Broca's area, right here at the back of the frontal lobe, is the main area for articulation, and this is the area, Wernicke's area, the main area for meaning and significance. And these 2 areas are what right now in me, on my left hemisphere, are doing most of the work. Now, if we go over to the other side, what happens in the Wernicke's area? Now, I've puzzled about that for so long, and then of course it hit me just as it would any child, because I don't think this is very profound. Could it be that it was the right hemisphere, what corresponds to Wernicke's area, the posterior part of the right temporal lobe, in right-handed people, and in most left-handed people too, that indeed was that area that processed all admonitory information, so that under a little bit of stress of making decision, it sent a voice over probably the anterior commissures, which connect that part of the brain. And that is what an auditory hallucination is. If you look down in the brain like this, and I'm sorry for those people who still can't see it, you have 2 hemispheres, the left and the right, and you have particularly the anterior commissures. How can you get all this information that is processed in the right hemisphere over to the other side? You have to put it into some kind of code, and there's no more majestic and wonderful code in the entire universe that we know of than human language. And that is what an auditory hallucination is. And I'm suggesting that it's the right hemisphere that is processing all admonitory information. And we can make tests of right hemispheric function and show that indeed that hemisphere would be what has the capacities of synthesis and fitting things together that would be required of these bicameral voices that created the very first civilizations that we that we can see. Now, to close up, I'm just going to say that when I first came on this idea. I have some neurosurgeons who are friends of mine, and I was wondering, would they open up a bone flap here on my right side? And I was a little scared, but I thought, oh, I'm a scientist, I'll get to face up to this. And stimulate the posterior part of the temporal lobe here. And would I hear the voices of the gods again? That was the question. Well, I was very relieved when I suddenly realized Walter Penfield had done this all before, and so I didn't have to go through it. And he did this as part of his surgery, where he was going to take out good parts of the right temporal lobe because of temporal lobe epilepsy. And that doesn't disturb this data that he found, but he would stimulate around the posterior part of the right temporal lobe to make sure that this wasn't the language hemisphere. Because when you do that in the language hemisphere, the person can't speak at all. And this is just a slight little electric current, like at the end of a paintbrush, a watercolor brush. And when he did this, here is the kind of data he got. One patient, they were all conscious and awake. One patient said, that voice, I lost touch with reality when stimulated right here. Another patient said, a voice saying words, but it's so faint that I could not get it. And a housewife said, someone talking, that man's voice, my father frightens me a lot. And Dr. Penfield went on questioning her about her father because he wanted to think there's a bank of memories. But no, she said, no, that isn't my father. I don't know why I said that. Another patient just heard the voice saying, sit still, sit still, sit still. And another 14-year-old boy, and see if this sounds like a memory, saw two men in armchairs singing at him, which is very strange, right there in the operating room. Another patient said, there they go yelling at me, doctor, stop them, and the voices lasted 21 seconds from just a little stimulation there. Well, that shows that there may be the remnants of the bicameral mind here, that maybe we can experiment with, let's say, schizophrenic patients who are hallucinating and find indeed that it is indeed the right hemisphere, the right temporal lobe, where most of this is going on. But regardless of that, this is the bicameral mind, and I think the evidence of it in texts is very, very strong. And if we had one lesson to remember from all this, it is that it means that we are conscious and have been conscious only the last 3,000 years. And before that, we're not. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is only 100 generations. And I think that this consciousness that makes us really what we mean by human is only 100 generations old. I think we can conclude from that we are all still very young. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to try to answer any questions. I know that some people have subways and everything else to get to and babysitters, so please don't feel badly about getting up and leaving. Yes, sir.
Sir, could you comment on the Eastern idea of personal consciousness, universal consciousness, and divine consciousness?
Well, I talk about the interesting idea of personal consciousness. Divine consciousness was the last. Universal consciousness. I would say that the last two I don't know anything about. I just have to leave it that way. There are other metaphysical views that one can have that I might not share. I am not making an inquiry in that direction. That's about all I can say. Yes, sir.
Do you see that there was perhaps a physiological change at the time that the bicameral mind fell
Yes.
from its position of dominance?
Was there a physiological change as we go from the bicameral mind to consciousness? Now, this is, excuse me again, this is a difficult question to answer. One of the ways that friends of mine look at this is in computer language and saying, well, the hardware hasn't changed, but the software has. And that's one analogical way of looking at it. I think areas of the brain can be used for different things at different stages in history, very roughly though. I think the language areas have always been there and always the same. But the idea of this area, if it is this area, processing of auditory information and then giving it to the other hemispheres in auditory hallucination, that became suppressed. Well, that is a neurological change. And that's about all you can say about it. It comes out in various things that we have in modern life, but it's not a fundamental change. It's only in the very minor kinds of connections that have not been learned up. But I think, when I say learned up, I mean hitched up by learning. I think that you could take any child born here in New York City, and if I could thrust him back into the city of Ur, with the great ziggurat above him and all this ceremony going on, and everybody hallucinating, that he would hallucinate too, and that he would have a brain just like them. I don't see, that's how it's changed. It's what is learned into the brain and what is suppressed in the brain. Yes, sir?
Is it the case then that if you go to non-urban societies that are isolated from all culture, older societies, do you find people who are not conscious?
If we go to non-urban societies today, and then do we find societies that are not conscious? No, I don't think we do. I think everybody in the world now is conscious, but there's a problem here about how conscious they are, and I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to grade it, because I've made some studies of my own among the differences between the highlanders and lowlanders in New Guinea. And the lowlanders, they're all around the coast, and they've been trading for centuries with all their partners, and they're no different from anybody else. But the highlanders are something else. Again, children can't learn percentages, for example, or division. And they have a very deficient sense of time. And you can't say that aloud over there. It doesn't go down right. And my sources over there have refused for me to ever print that or publish it, and so I won't. It's very difficult to study. But that's not a very clear answer. I wish we did have evidence that way, but I don't find it. Yes?
As you look back over the history of the evolution of consciousness, can you project or speculate on where it may be headed?
Where?
Consciousness, the directions.
Where is consciousness going? Here we've come through this long thing, 10,000 years, and now another 2,000 BC. Where's it going to be at 10,000? I've done enough speculating, I guess. But I will say this, that there are numbers of things in our society that I think are very, very positive and very interesting. And I think we're going to, when I compare what we have in comparison to what it was even 200 years ago, I think that we are much more conscious human beings. And I think since this time, consciousness has been changing all the time. So we have much more sympathy for animals, more sympathy for other human beings. Of course, this is all on the basis of technology, and it's very hard to study. But I would think we are going to go on that way. I'm very interested in the human potential movement, where we could have more control over ourselves and over our own behavior that we might regard as neurotic. I think that it's very hopeful in the future. On the other hand, there's some negative things. I mean, everybody is going to be using the computer as a model for the brain. And she's pointing to him. He's a computer expert. And I wonder if that's going to diminish consciousness or not, because I don't think you can get consciousness on the computer. But I don't know anything about it. Yes, sir, in the white shirt.
It seems to me that your whole talk started off with the question of how did the breakdown of the bicameral mind
The question is, have I answered the question of how what I have said about the origin of consciousness ties into natural selection? And the questioner doesn't think that I have answered that, and he is absolutely correct. I do not think that consciousness came through natural selection. I think it is learned on the basis of culture. And I'm sorry I was missing out so many points.
Then there has to be a follow-up question. Where did the bicameral mind come from in the first place? Is it an animal element? Can one find it in an animal? And if one can, then what was the survival of our developing it unconsciously without culture?
I'm sorry I didn't have enough time to spend on it. Back here, I think that, no, the bicameral mind is linguistic, it's language. And that it developed, language is all through this period is developing. And then it started to learn these hallucinations. Until 40,000 BC, we find there's a lot more stones and sharper spear points. And I imagine then people would be sharpening things, and they might hear a hallucination, sharper, sharper, sharper. And this would be the result of it. A very useful thing. What's the advantage of it? Oh, tremendous advantage. Because you can keep people at their job. Remember, you shouldn't go back and identify with them. If you go to chimpanzees and see how they can concentrate or not concentrate on a problem. Friends of mine, the Savage Rumbos down at Emory, have told me this. One was a very simple string problem, where they simply had to pull a string for a banana, and the other chimpanzee watching all this was supposed to learn to do that, just simply pull the string to get a banana. Well, the other chimpanzee took a hold of the string. It was sort of interesting. Wrapped it around him here, then wrapped it around him here, and played all over the place with the string and forgot about the banana. He couldn't hold his attention on this particular problem. I'm saying if he had language, that would hold his attention one bit, and if he had an hallucination saying banana, 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 he would indeed have the beginnings of a bicameral mind and be very advantageous. Yes, back there. I'm not quite sure. It did strong anxiety.
Strong anxiety have an effect on the brain, especially that center of the brain we're talking
Yes.
about. It's possible that strong emotion affects, it might touch off hallucinations or affect that part of the brain.
Yes. Would strong emotion set off the posterior part of the right temporal lobe, you mean? And indeed, instead of saying strong emotions, I would say conflicting and stress emotions. And this is how I look at schizophrenia, that indeed they have a lower threshold than most of us do, but that there always is stress in the picture. I'm sure some of you know the double bind theory of Bateson and other theories like this, which seem to be valid when the person, the poor patient, doesn't know what to do, and that kind of conflict indeed can cause these voices. So it's a good question. Yes, just behind there.
I want to thank you for your beautiful contribution. It's the most original book I've ever come across. And my question has to do with how much of it comes from literary criticism in the sense of building up a metaphor, and maybe at one time metaphor was reality. How much of your work comes from concepts of metaphor?
How much of my book comes from concepts of metaphor? It's very, very hard to answer. I am not in literary criticism, and I just felt this is very, very important, the metaphorical basis of things, and I've been studying this for a long time, and it just came to me that way. So I can't say, that I rationally based it on anything, if that answers your question. I'm trying to spread myself around a little bit here. All right, you who are waving this way, and then I'm going to move over here.
Can consciousness exist without content? And if it can't exist without content, is it
Can consciousness exist without content?
And if it can't, is the content the actual consciousness itself? For example, you are in my consciousness
Yes.
now, and maybe that's all consciousness is you and everything.
Is consciousness just the content of consciousness? That's again hard to question, because I think there's certain operations that go on, the analog I narrotizing in a mind space, which is behind everything. So as you're conscious of me now, it's also within the context of the 92nd Street Y and what you're going to do later and what you've done before.
But that story, isn't it possible to be here without the analog eye, to just be aware of a certain something which we call the world?
Yes, it is. Another way of defining consciousness, and this goes back to scholastics of the Middle Ages, that there are two kinds of definitions, denotative and constitutive. And the denotative definition of of consciousness is what is introspectable. The constitutive definition is the theory that I presented, an analog eye narrotizing the mind space. Now, introspectable, it doesn't mean that we're introspecting all the time. So that is something, what you've just said, in another kind of way. Is there somebody in the balcony up there? Yes.
Yes, it's not clear to me if you're suggesting that all of those people would hear things that came through they were born with this knowledge, or if they picked it up as children.
If you have a question there.
Yeah, the question is which. I mean,
Oh, they picked it up as children. And in the society, oh yes, I don't think it came from anywhere else. I'm going to sort of walk down the steps here so I can hear some of you a little better. Ooh, getting stiff. All right, somebody here? Yes. Yes.
Are you defining consciousness as the recognition that the self is separate from the mind and the self is separate from all those around us? That it's not that the brain is the right, one part of the brain is talking to another part of the brain, and that somehow we are, what is consciousness? The more awareness that we as a self are separate.
I don't know how to answer that. What is consciousness but that we are separate as the self?
I'm still not clear what consciousness is.
It is what is introspectable. And also, it's analog eye narrotizing in a mind space. The self is something else, again, that I think has changed through history, and I haven't talked about that tonight. I could give a whole lecture about the growth of the self to its complexities now. Yes, madam?
At what age does a child become conscious?
Awfully good question. What age does a child become conscious? And I've tried to do studies on that, and of course I would say that language has to be there first, and it's just about the time that he learns language. And I'm trying to find this empirically. If you have any good ideas about how I can study it, why, I'd be very grateful. Yes. Yes, sir.
If the consciousness is the analog eye basing its decisions on some model it has of what's going on, and if that is a more sophisticated way of making decisions, and apparently we're evolving into that more and more, is the eventuality that could take the place of mere simple neurological reflexes?
Would consciousness take the place of mere neurological reflexes?
In terms of acting on a sophisticated decision made by the analog?
It's a hard question to answer because, in general, no. But in some ways, yes.
Well, is that the direction in which this evolutionary process seems to be moving?
I would question whether this is an evolutionary process. You brought that into the question. I think it's more a development question. For example, if I walk out of this splendid theater tonight and somebody throws a glass of water in my face and intends it, I may get angry. If I were to act on impulse, I might go over and push him or something like that, or register some displeasure. But I think with consciousness, one can realize that that this should not be dealt with in that kind of way. And I think that doesn't come through evolution, but it comes through learning and acculturation, whatever you want to call it. Yes?
Does the flow that passes through the anterior division or perhaps the corpus callosum, does that have to be verbal? Does it have to be language? Could it be pictorial for, say, a nonverbal person?
Like a what?
A visualis?
Oh. How about going over the anterior commissures or the corpus callosum? Does that have to be auditory or could it be visual? Certainly, when you take the corpus callosum, a whole part of it is visual. But I am suggesting that in the corpus callosum, it is auditory, and that is what is necessary in the bicameral mind. Now, not entirely, because people do have bicameral visions back in those times. And there are examples of schizophrenics who are deaf and who will have a visual hallucination of somebody in a white robe coming in and signing to them something. It wasn't there at all. Now, that certainly is a visual hallucination, and I don't know how it works. We've got to take people who haven't answered questions, ask questions. Yes?
Yes, are we limited by the fact that we all occupy a separate brain or an analog eye in terms of the evolution of consciousness? Or do you see any possibility of, say, something similar to an analog we?
Do I see any possibility of there being an analog we? I think that involves a little bit of metaphysics. I really can't say. Yes?
In modern man, for example, if you're very strongly right-handed, your language is centered on your left side of your brain. So if you were suffer stroke to the left side of your brain, you would not recover language function based on the right side of the brain. So if I'm thinking, I'm trying to figure out where the bicameral voices would come from in right-handed people, since the right side of the brain is not produce language. So I thought, well, what about left-handed people where language is shared on the two sides of the brain?
Those very rare people.
Right, so is the bicameral mind, and of course in modern man, you actually have a larger corpus callosum if you're left-handed, so you have communication. Is there any evidence in early man that there are more left-handed people?
No, there isn't. There's the question on left-handedness, and the literature here is sort of a little doubtful about the left-handers having a larger corpus callosum, but it's a fascinating problem. And the questioner also said, how about people who have language on both sides? And that is extremely rare and very interesting. I just don't know how to answer it. There is no evidence that there is an increase in left-handedness, but nevertheless, I have a suspicion that there has been, as I've tested it out. But I just don't know. Yes, sir.
Two questions. First, has there been follow-up to art consciousness? Is it available?
Just journal articles. Has there been a follow-up to my book? There are journal articles.
Second part, or second question. In Arts and Consciousness, there was a drawing that showed, I believe it was Greek or it might have been Mycenaean. It showed a room, several rooms, and the suggestion about it that there were gods or idols in every room. That people had a relationship. There was always a god present wherever they went.
This is Cataltuyuk, up in Anatolia.
Okay, and it struck me when I saw that there are a lot of people that have televisions in every room. People do not watch television as much as they listen to it. It occurred to me in looking at that picture, it set off a thought in my mind. We may possibly be slipping back. Always there, speaking to us and telling us what to do.
Are we slipping back with TV being in every room? I just say no, I don't think we are. Yes.
This is a
Take one and then the other.
You mentioned that if someone today could go back, they would develop a bicameral
I believe so, yes. If somebody from the past were brought up in New York City, would they be just like us? And I think they would.
But in that case, are we talking about just a matter of style or a way of expressing ourselves? We're all the same. They're as conscious as we are, but they put it in different phraseology because they didn't have science then. Today we put it in different terms, but they had the analog eye. They just didn't express it that way. When they decided something, they said, God told me this. Now we say, I thought. Is it just
Yep.
semantics or words we're talking about?
Could this just be a matter of linguistic usage, and that people back in ancient times used the metaphor of God speaking to them, and that we just use other terms because of our culture? I don't think so one single bit. Why? Because of all the idols, all the rituals, all of that is going on is tremendously indicative of something much more. I better go to other questions. I'll be glad to come back to you. Just a second. Yes.
It's curious why my question is related. I want to invite you to comment on a possibility. I don't know how tangible it is or not. Indians from the Amazon Delta, some tribes emerging, obviously a bit ahead of the Stone Age development in every sense. According to your theory, they would be a prime example of it. You have to create a language to communicate with them. And over the practical things, it's very easy because there's a word that stands for a stone, or for a pitcher, or for whatnot. But at some point, these people, as the Brazilian government tries to rehabilitate them into humanity, will teach them the language. Will these people, A, be able to understand that we have a concept of I separate from we, even within the same category? By your theory, they will not have any idea about that, for as long as they are members of one generic group and ritually related to people above and people below. Everything lateral is indistinguishable. So, A, how will they be able to understand and use our language, which is based on the idea, on the concept of separate identity? And secondly, will they lament the loss of their gods as they acquire language, including
I mean, it's a very
objective tenses and so on?
good question. Certainly, I often get asked the question, as I was earlier this evening by somebody here, about how about in rural sections, are there not people that were probably would not be conscious? Now, I have looked all over the world for this, and everybody seems to have been contacted by conquest, by missionaries, by anthropologists themselves, all of whom were never cognizant of any possibility of differences in mentality. In fact, that was verboten among the Columbia School, of which Margaret Mead was a good representative. And what I found was that there was one and possibly two tribes in the Amazonian basis that had never been contacted. In fact, they had killed a succession of 8 anthropologists, all German, incidentally. And they were very dangerous, and they just killed on sight. And the Brazilian anthropologists, knowing all this, came and, as I understand, they camped across the river from an open space there, where they knew they were. And every single day, they took a boat over and left gifts. It might be pots and pans, or knives, or axes, and then didn't try to contact them at all, just sailed back. And did that for 2 years, until this tribe came across the river, and there are films that I've seen that are just beautiful of these childlike people who are murderers coming, and they've never seen beards before, so they come up to the Brazilians and feel them all over, and laughing and giggling at each other. It's quite astonishing. Now, what I hope they did was plant tape recorders over there so as to pick up their language, although we don't know it now, until we've learned it later, and then go back and look at how it translates, because that might be some good evidence. I don't know anything more than that. So, yes, sir.
Why is it that every language in the world is very complex?
Why is it that every language in the world is complex and there are no simple languages? One of the interesting things about languages is that the older they are, the more complex they are. And that has been used as an argument against something that I've presented here, which would say that indeed language only begins somewhere in here. But there are reasons that linguists can give to show why indeed a primitive language should be very, very complicated. But I can't explain them here. Yes, madam?
Because consciousness is based on language, do you believe the consciousness is different from one linguistic group to the next?
Since consciousness is based on language, does this mean it's different from one linguistic group to another? I simply cannot say and do not know. It would certainly be a wonderful thing to try to study. And I would certainly think that indeed it would make a difference. But it's very, very hard to study these differences. Yes?
Since there are so many mind-changing drugs on the market and in science, couldn't it be that all you call conscious is a chemical process that can be changed?
Since there are so many mind-changing drugs on the market, couldn't this mean that everything I've called consciousness is simply a physiological chemistry that could be changed? With every single thing that happens in the body or in the brain, there is a chemical change. That does not mean that that is the explanation of it at all. And I do not agree that. I think when we use the word just, what we're trying to do is to shove the problem away. It's not important, and I think it is important. Yes, madam.
In studying ego development of an individual infant through child and adulthood, is it possible that in each individual there is this breakdown of the bicameral mind?
Since if we study the whole trajectory of a young child growing up from infancy, is there any possibility that there is something like the bicameral mind that breaks down there? One thing that happens is that there are certain traces of the bicameral mind in early childhood. We haven't brought up the matter of dreams, and I could give you a whole lecture on dreams and the remarkable change in dreams that went on all through this period. And one of the things that a bicameral dream is, like the Book 2 of the Iliad, those of you who know it, where Agamemnon hears in this dream a voice that tells him to start the Trojan War. So children can start off with what perhaps we should call monster dreams. I was hearing of another one just the other night, in which children wake up screaming as is a horse beating his hoofs on the bed, or a man in a big coat coming in the room, or a red face looking at them, or something like that, which is something like the bicameral.
Children who are awake, let's say, might be afraid of witches and boogeymen.
That's right, and this may relate to it. Let me tell you one little story that I think might relate to this about the possibilities. I was giving a lecture, or rather a seminar, on imaginary playmates, something I'm very interested in, something I think goes back to bicameral mind, where I think everybody had their own imaginary playmate that grew up with them and became their personal god, their Ili in Mesopotamia, their Ka in Egypt. And half the class had imaginary playmates. We talked about them, and it was very interesting. And then after class, this slightly older looking woman, I guess I should call her, who with a worried look on her face said, "I couldn't raise my hand and talk about it in class. It's much too serious with me. When I was young, both my parents were poor and they had to go to work. They left me in the care of my schizophrenic grandmother at home. And she would hallucinate a different voice in every room of the house. And I started having an imaginary playmate, a different one in every room of the house, and would hear their voices just as she heard their voices. And then my mother realized what was happening and was horrified and came home and sent the grandmother to a mental hospital while she stayed at home trying to train her daughter out of this. And this young woman said to me, and it worked, but Now I am older, and whenever I get into times of stress, all my imaginary playmates come back. And they're all grown up like me, and they all stand around and try to tell me what to do. And then she asked me a question that a rather stupid bachelor, my girlfriend at the time, had to tell me what was going on. I didn't realize it. Is it innate or is it learned? She said to me. And of course, I should have realized she was going to get married and she wasn't going to have children. They were going to have to go through this awful thing. But I didn't, and I've forgotten what I said. I hope I said the right thing. Yes, sir.
Are there degrees of consciousness? Would you say that Maslow's concept of peak experience is a higher state of consciousness?
Are there degrees of consciousness, and is Maslow's peak experience a higher state of consciousness? I'd like to think so. I don't know. I don't know. I've been so busy trying to trace things out in this kind of fashion. That's a good question. Stay with it. Yes.
Chronic alcoholics who have too little vitamin B get Wernicke syndrome, where they talk to themselves all the time and they answer the conversations with unknown voices. How does that have to do with your theory?
I don't know how. You sure it's called Wernicke's syndrome?
Yeah.
Wernicke's syndrome in chronic alcoholics, where they start talking to themselves. And do they hear the voices? They do, but it isn't really known. What does this have to do with my theory? Well, I think there are lots of things that can tap into this kind of mechanism. And I certainly would suggest that that is what is happening. But let's say something else. I think most of us talk to ourselves a great deal. And I don't know where the idea came that, we shouldn't talk to ourselves. I think it's a darn good thing to do, that we can find out how other people are going to respond and how we should respond. So this may just be an exaggeration of that, of talking to themselves. I can sometimes be talking to myself, lickety-split or something like that, and suddenly a word will come out loud. If somebody heard me or saw me at the time, well, they might say I had Wernicke's syndrome. Yes?
In times of public stress, charismatic leaders seem to be able to tap into something like that and grab a lot of people's consciousness to sometimes evil ends. And I was wondering if it isn't possible that maybe way back then there were similar charismatic leaders that may have led people into some of these beliefs.
In times of stress, is it not possible that a charismatic leader can come about and more easily tap into this kind of mechanism and then lead people in certain ways? And I think this might relate back to the question back there about, is there such a thing as an analog we? I don't know, there might be a relationship here. Yes, I just think that that is possible indeed. I think the Jim Jones phenomenon is something like that. I think you can go to other places and see, terrible things. I've often thought of Nazi Germany in this kind of thing, but I don't know, and it's almost too easy to make extrapolations that kind of way. Yes, sir.
How do you view channeling type phenomena? And does consciousness preclude bicameral type experience?
How do I view channeling type of phenomena? I'm afraid I don't. I think they start off as sincere, with people hearing auditory hallucinations, and then people start making money on it, and then it becomes very insincere, and I'm very cynical about it. What was the second part?
The second part is, does consciousness actually preclude having bicameral?
Does consciousness preclude having a bicameral mind? Let me remind you of somebody I've mentioned, Emanuel Swedenborg. Anybody interested in this would repay study. I haven't studied him very much, but I think most of you have heard about the Swedenborgian Church, which is all based on his findings. He would be in a crowd and he would say, could you move your head a little bit? Yes, Jesus. What is it? Oh, well, Socrates over here has something that wants to bring up in a question. Moses here wants to also add into the... He could hallucinate all these people. And does it all make sense? Well, it's all written down in numbers and numbers and numbers of books. And he was a brilliant person. He was no idiot savant. He was a brilliant physicist and everything else. And he's quite astonishing. William Blake is another one who actually heard his songs from angels. And as he was dying, the last words he said to his wife, as he was hearing this song and repeating it to her, remember, tell them these are not my songs. Now, there's another example of that. And William Blake turns out to at one time have been a disciple of Swedenborg and then turned against it. I think it's quite a remarkable juxtaposition that you have in history. That, as you probably remember, about go to another extreme, the 4-minute mile. Once, was it Roger Bannister cracked it? Then a lot of other people did. Somehow we felt we could do that. Well, maybe this is what gave Blake the idea that he could do this. He certainly was convinced that anybody could, and that he could teach this to anybody, to hear voices like this that would say, tiger, tiger, burning bright, and these wonderful things, and claimed to have taught this to his wife. But I don't know exactly how strong the evidence is. Yes?
There is supposed to be an upsurge of mysticism now in the world. And I'm wondering if this is not a reality that people think is a bicameral mind that really is mysticism.
And really what?
It's mystical.
Well, when the questioner is talking about an upsurge of mysticism, and I don't think mysticism is something with a capital M that you can ascribe causes to in quite that way. I guess that's the best answer I can give. Yes?
What would you say the link between consciousness and creativity is?
What's the link between consciousness and creativity? Well, nothing could be more creative than the making of our great civilizations back in this period that I think the right hemisphere did. And I therefore tend to think, and we've got to go on empirical evidence and perform experiments to show this, that indeed creativity is a right hemisphere type of thing. It doesn't mean that the left hemisphere, well, look at my speech right now. I mean, my speech it's a creative thing. And yet my left hemisphere is doing it. So I can't say that creativity is just the right hemisphere. It's all over the brain, but the kind of creativity we might be talking about, of fitting things together in a new kind of pattern, might indeed be right hemispheric. Now that doesn't say that's its relationship to the bicameral mind. It does not say what its relationship is to consciousness. And I just don't think I can say much about that. Yes, I'm trying to look for people who haven't asked a question before.
The person who's in a hypnotic trance, the person who's dreaming, these states are being referred to as altered states of consciousness. How do you view these states?
How about altered states of consciousness? To use a term that Charles Tart popularized, I wouldn't use that term. I'd say altered states of mind, perhaps. I think that in deep hypnosis, consciousness is more or less in abeyance. It is not there. And it's something that is going back to what I call a general bicameral paradigm, in which the hypnotist himself is taking the part of the God. But that's rather speculative. This is what I say in my book. And there's a lot more to say about it. Yes?
You might think on the surface of it that if you came across an isolated group that was bicameral, they listened to gods, that this might be smoking gun evidence for your idea. On the other hand, if you talk to them, they might say, no, Jaynes is all wrong. We're really talking to gods. It's not my right hemisphere.
Yeah.
So I wonder now, what then would be smoking gun evidence for your idea? If you can imagine an experiment or an archaeological find, what have you? What form would it take?
Well, I don't quite agree with your analysis that if you found this tribe and they were insisted they were listening to gods, not to their right hemisphere, which of course they would say. I don't think that that disproves that evidence. I think
You might be in a better position to know than you because they're listening.
I doubt that they, excuse me, it might sound very pompous of a scientist to say, But I honestly don't think so. Now, there are lots of shamans all around the world who indeed hear voices. Now, you're not going to tell them that they hear it from their right hemispheres. Of course not. They are touching in a reality beyond. And that's where the help comes from, that is going to heal people. And we're to find out what to do. Of course they're not going to say from their right hemispheres. They don't know what the right hemisphere is. Now, do I say that I know more than they do about it? I'm saying that a scientific hypothesis says one thing and they might say another, that's all. Yes?
Given that you said that consciousness is based in culture, what do you think about the things that have been said about, like, the Emperor's monkey and the morphological field?
Wait a minute, I didn't quite catch that.
I'm asking your opinion on the studies and the theories that have been done around the 100 monkey syndrome and morphological fields.
Is this about washing things, the 100 monkeys? Yes, and that I think has been thoroughly disproved. Well, I don't know of other kinds of things. Well, I mean, is this an example of something parapsychological? I don't even know the 100 things. I'm just told this once by somebody who immediately said that, oh, one of the monkeys swam over, and there was a transfer of culture. And it goes back to something called, what's his name, who wrote this pseudo-Jungian thing called New Science of Mind. And I'm afraid I think that's rubbish. I have to say that. I mean, do you know who I'm talking about?
Sheldrake.
Sheldrake, yes. And that where one part of a species learned it one way, the other species, the other way across somewhere else has it. No, I just don't think this is true. Yes? Is monotheism a consequence of the breakdown of bicameral mind? Good question. Yes, it is. Up here we have all kinds, many gods all over the place until we get the breakdown here, and then we come to Akhenaten, who's about 1400 BC, and he's the first person to enunciate monotheism, saying that there is only one God, Ra, and destroys all the idols of the other gods. And I probably heard a voice, but we don't know, saying, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." And then it's just 100 years later that Moses, of course, comes in and leads the Exodus, in which we find the same thing. And we have monotheism thereafter, indeed, in the Hebrew world, which is extremely important. Greece was sort of caught up in an awful lot of things because of its polytheism at that time. And they, I think, could have done better if they were monotheistic. Yes?
Do you accept Gilbert Ryle's concept of mind as a ghost in the machine?
Do I accept Gilbert Ryle's ghost in the machine concept of mind? No, I don't. I think Gilbert Ryle is sort of a pseudo-behaviorist, and I don't think that he, as a philosopher, faced some of the questions of what consciousness does, such as imagining things in the future, that it is this functional thing, very important and very good for us to do. And so I wouldn't call it a ghost in the machine. Yes, back there?
Have we lost something by losing our contact with the bicameral mind?
Have we lost something by losing our contact with the bicameral mind? One can say so, and of course people felt so back in these early periods because it was such certainty coming from above. Wouldn't we all like to have that kind of certainty? But then we'd be fanatics. We'd be James Joneses or Son of Sam's or something like that, and these awful things, because that's where fanaticism leads to. So I don't think we've lost anything that we should try to regain. That kind of certainty I don't think is around with ethical people. Yes, sir?
If the development of consciousness and the analog I seems to be leading to more and more subjective models of the environment, wouldn't that mean that there would be more and more difficulty in dealing with each other?
That we get closer to more and more subjective models with consciousness, therefore, doesn't mean it's going to be more difficult to deal with each other. I don't know how to answer that question at all. Yes, you're right there.
When you touched on the subject of what caused the breakdown, and you mentioned the advent of writing, are there other factors
Yes.
you haven't touched on that you mentioned?
Well, the big exposure of the island theory, that's rather ad hoc explanation. The overpopulation. These are tremendously successful civilizations. And even the gods are saying they're derogatory about human beings, talking about them as the black-headed ones. We've got to get rid. This comes from cuneiform literature. It sounds so strange to have the gods saying that we've got to kill off a few of the people. But this happens in the Hebrew Bible too, if you remember, when things we like to forget about the early parts of the Bible. Yes, just a few more questions. I want to take people who haven't answered before.
Tell us the name of your book.
The next, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Yes, sir.
Where do you place in your system the paranormal capacity?
Where do I place the paranormal capacity in my system? I'm not sure I have a system, and I have tried to study the paranormal, particularly when I was way back in graduate school. We all did. I couldn't find evidence for it at all. Yes.
Well, often before death, I understand people hallucinate. Could that be a regression to the bicameral mind once again?
People hallucinate just before they die. I don't know that literature very well. It could be. It could be. I don't know.
Is there no coincidence when the schizophrenic so often hears the voice of God? Does that relate to your theory?
Yes, indeed it does. Schizophrenia is she asked a question about schizophrenics hearing the voice of God. Does this relate to my theory? Schizophrenics are people who, under stress, indeed have this mechanism of hearing hallucinations. And indeed, these hallucinations are usually religious, usually go back to the voice of God, and are usually very critical of the human beings. And it is a partial relapse to the bicameral mind, but only a partial relapse. There's some people here who have not asked questions, and I think I remember you having to. I'll be by here sometimes.
Is there a philosopher or a psychologist that has had the greatest influence on your work and your thought?
The psychologists who have had the greatest influence on my work and thought, I'm not sure, but I'd like to say William Jaynes, although, because I love him, I don't know whether he has really had an influence on my work or not. I go back and read him for pleasure. Just a final few questions of people who haven't asked, and I'll be around. Yes, back there.
Everything that you define consciousness as not being necessary for instance,
Yes. Yes.
how do you think of that realm of subjective experience? Do you think of it as unconsciousness or just neurological reflex, or do you think of it as another bigger type of consciousness that is non-linguistic and non-visual, like another type of being that is a human being and a human mind?
How do I view things like that?
Other realm, how do you think of that other thing that you define?
I don't use the word unconscious, I use the word non-conscious. And that we do most of the things we do non-consciously. I don't like to use the word unconscious because that gets into all kinds of ramifications with Freud, and I sort of want to leave that behind.
And as a follow-up, how does the analog eye manage to identify itself with that non-conscious realm? For instance, when I'm weighing the stones, I still think it's me, the analog eye, weighing the stones, even though it's a non-conscious thing that's happening. How does that, it implies to me that your definition of consciousness is too small in a way, and that the fact that we can identify ourselves with these non-conscious things indicates that it is still a form of consciousness. Non-consciousness is still a form of consciousness.
Well, I don't think so. I think you're slipping back into thinking of consciousness as being the whole thing, but it's a very complicated question that you're saying, so you are thinking very hard. I think maybe we ought to call it an evening about now. I'll be around. So, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.